Let's talk about some of the work we did today on the van to get the heater up and running. Most of the research and work I've been doing is figuring out essentially how to connect propane gas to the heater safely and effectively, and what kind of fittings we would need, what kind of lines would be the best, and I'm going to walk you through that a little bit. For starters, we knew that we were going to want to use copper line for as much of the gas line run as possible. This is because, at least per my research, copper holds up really well to vibrations, so having something like that in a moving vehicle is really important. And once the copper line is set up properly, if it's done properly, it really should never leak. Other types of propane lines that you may have seen at like a grill or something like that are going to be more prone to ultimately break down and leak. And so what is the danger of a leak? Well, number one, propane's a flammable gas, so you would rather not have that accumulating inside of your camper van. But number two, it's probably more likely to kill you by displacing all the air and actually causing asphyxiation. So really important to not have any leaks. Propane is odorless. However, there is an additive in most propane tanks that does give it a bit of an odor, so you should be able to detect it. So what different types of fittings could I use to ultimately connect that copper tubing, up to something like a propane tank? And you can start off with something like a compression fitting. I can pull these off and show you. It's not going to pop out, but this kind of inner sleeve here, that's called the olive. And what happens with a compression fitting is the copper tubing is going to go in here, and as I tighten it down, it's going to gradually compress that olive, which will form a seal around the tube. There are other types of fittings which are more preferred though and less likely to leak, and that would be flared fittings. So this end of this little union thing here is not flared, whereas this end is flared. And ultimately what you want to have happen is you create a flare using a flare tool in the copper line, which butts up against that piece there, and then you use a nut essentially to tighten down, and that's supposed to be one of the most secure, least likely to leak connections you have. So why even bother with the compression fittings? Well, you probably shouldn't if you don't have to. Unfortunately, on the back of the heater that I'm using, it does recommend you use a compression fitting there. But for any other places I'm connecting up the line, I'm using a flaring technique. Other considerations are just in size and how you're going to step up and down sizes. So here's a union with a flare on both ends, but this is like a 3/8 fitting, and this is kind of standard what's going to come from most propane regulators. So you have to figure out how to kind of step that down to something smaller like this, which is a 1/4 inch, which is what most copper tubing sizes are. Next, how do you cut the tubing? Well, you've got these handy dandy cutting tools here. The way you use this is you connect it to the tube and spin it around, and you progressively, slowly tighten this, just kind of finger tight until it essentially falls off. And that's kind of the great thing about working with copper, is it's just so malleable. But I'm going to show you how this works here. So I'll kind of just tighten it down. Again, this is like almost less than finger tightness. So it's just on there. I'm going to start spinning it, and then gradually tighten and spin. Gradually tighten, again, not even quite finger tight, like just below that. A little tighter, spin, a little tighter, spin, a little tighter. And again, there's really no other way to cut this tubing without, crimping it or causing it to deform. And look at that, it just kind of falls right off. Perfect. All right, next, now how can we kind of make nice little bends like this in it? Well, like I said, copper's pretty malleable, so you can, with bigger runs, with kind of bigger arcing turns, you can just use your hands. The problem is if you need a steep turn like that and you just try to bend it with your hands, you will ultimately deform this and kind of cause a kink here, which is not what you want to have with gas flowing through, because even a small deformity like that can screw up the flow. So what you have instead is a bending tool like this. There's different sizes here, and we're going to go with the 1/4 inch. So I'm just gonna kind of insert the tube in there, and then you can kind of just choose how extreme of an angle you want. So that would be about a perfect 90-degree bend. And if you see, there is no kind of kink there or change in the diameter. Pretty cool. And then lastly, how do we turn this into a flared edge? And that would be using a flare tool, which uses a combination of this and this. So first things first, we'll lock this into the right size. And it's just got little numbers here, and we'll pick 1/4 inch. And you kind of have to practice with this to figure out how much you kind of need hanging out to get the right amount of flare. So I'm just going to hand tighten this, but this thing, as we kind of attach it, will ultimately push these two sides together to kind of lock this in place. And then the way this works, this is going to lock on there. And if you look, as I rotate this top part, you'll see that thing spin there, and it's off axis. And it's moving down and kind of slowly pushing that copper into a nice flare shape, and I'll show you that really quick. So let's attach this first. There's a little hole here that this will attach to. Okay, now I'm just going to kind of crank this down until the gap is closed there at the end. And it is, so now that pipe is really locked in place. And then I'll try to get you a view. We're going to crank this down and start the flaring process. This thing has a cool pressure release, so it's going to click when enough pressure is applied, so you can't really overdo it, which is nice. There's the click. So I'm going to back this out and we'll release it. And that just slides off. We open this up. And now you've got this perfectly flared edge here. And this will make joining it up to something like this a lot easier. So here's that kind of flare connection there. And then you would have a nut on here which you'd crank down over the top. All right, now that we've talked about those fittings, quickly look inside the van at what we've got going on. Here is what's called a propane locker box that we built in. Ultimately, this would have a kind of a roof to it that we'd clamp down on top, so this will be airtight. Reason being that even with changes in altitude or temperature, it will vent, and it will vent off gases so that this thing doesn't like explode, which is a safety feature. Problem with that is we're inside of an enclosed space and we don't want propane in here. So at the bottom here you can't see, but there's actually a hole with a vent that goes down through the bottom of the van, and that will let the propane escape because propane's heavier than air. Next, what we have going on is one of these kind of hookups that we wouldn't want outside the box because they can break down with time, but coming from the tank into a 2-stage regulator. On most grills you're just going to see a 1-stage. There's a fitting here. We did ultimately have leaks here and here, which we found by trying to smell, but sometimes when they're so tiny you can't tell where they're coming from, you can't hear anything. So a great trip is mixing together a bunch of soapy water and kind of painting it over any place where there's potential for leaks. And what we saw were tiny little bubbles forming, and so we knew that there were leaks here. So I'm using a little bit of this propane specific Teflon tape to have a good seal here to the 2-stage regulator. Then it comes out here, so there's a fitting here, and then attaching up to this line. And then this is what's called a bulkhead fitting, which is cool. Inside and out, this is all one piece, and then you screw down this to essentially lock it in place. Ultimately, I'll put some silicone around here so it's airtight, but that's how we bridge that gap. Next, you got to step down from 3/8 to 1/4 inch, so that's what this fitting is. And then finally, here is our flare fitting. So this is what that nut looks like, and on the edge of here is a little flare, and you just tighten that down about a 1/4 turn tighter than finger tightness. So gas is now flowing down this line here, and we can pretty this up later. And by the way, all of these hookups and stuff are going to be underneath a bed anyway. Coming back here onto a compression fitting and then into our heater. which is on and working. So we've got 2 lines here. One's to power, which this isn't a final hookup, we're just testing it. So there's our battery that's giving us power. We're also using carbon monoxide and smoke detector, and then a propane or natural gas detector there just to make sure we're safe even when we're testing it. We've got another line which runs up behind the wall to the thermostat. Pretty simple design, that's just showing the ambient temperature inside the van, and then you can move it up and down to set it. So it's running right now, and it's working beautifully. So we've got cold air coming in here, propane combusts, and then it warms up air which it sends out here. Now you might think there might be some danger of carbon monoxide poisoning and just kind of breathing in combusted gases, but what's actually happening is there are 2 vents below this unit. Those 2 vents come out of the bottom of the van here. This is the intake, so this is where air comes in to be combusted, and that's kind of running up away to the head of the van that way and taking in fresh air. And then this is where all the exhaust gases come out, and I've routed that here, and then it has to stick out a little ways so that you don't have any pooling of those gases underneath the van that could then seep in. 2 different types of silicone. This line gets kind of hot, so that's like a high temperature RTV silicone, and that's just regular silicone. And that's the heater setup, so it's mounted, it's up and running, the gas lines aren't leaking. So it was a big step forward today with regard to the van, and we'll keep you updated.